Hey everybody, welcome to the Undiscovered Games video podcast where we take a look at the lesser known board games of the world and share those with you. Today I'm presenting something new. This is called Board Game versus Board Game. My objective here is to compare two very similar games, and only one of them gets to stay in my collection. I don't need to own both of these, and I want to figure out which one I really do want to keep. I'm going to compare these two games across various categories like components and theme and gameplay, and for each category I will assign points to one game or the other, and by the end I hope to have a decisive winner. For this episode it's Lowenherz versus DOMAINE. Now, Lowenherz came first. This came out in 1997 by Rio Grande Games. And then 6 years later came DOMAINE, which is not really a reprint, but it's a reworking of Lowenherz. The two games are different from each other. DOMAINE was released by Mayfair and Cosmos, but neither one of these games ever got reprinted. So they're both over 20 years old now. And I don't know a lot of people who have played either one of these, which makes them a perfect topic of discussion for this channel right here. Now, I'm not going to do a full review of these games. I've had hit and miss relationships with both of these, but I do know that I want to keep one in my collection. I like it enough to keep. I just have never been able to decide, so I wanted to make this video and really dissect these games in detail and hopefully be able to pick a winner. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of a little game called Catan, or Settlers of Catan. Well, that was designed by the same designer, Klaus Teuber. Lowenherz and DOMAINE are very different from Catan, although I do see some very slight similarities, so you can definitely tell it's the same designer. But the basic idea here is territory building and expanding. You're going to have these walls that define your territories, and you're trying to expand them to get more points. The problem is you're going to run into your opponents eventually, so you have to strategically use your knights to both defend your areas and also attack and invade your opponent's areas. It's a very mean, interactive, cutthroat style game. Points will fluctuate back and forth as you gain and lose territory throughout the game. So both games are centered around that same basic concept. However, they play much differently from each other regarding how you take your actions, how you use money, and how you score. I'll go over that later in the video when we talk about gameplay comparisons, but first we're going to look at aesthetics and components. I'm going to break these down into several categories to compare the games and then assign points to one game or another in each category, anywhere from a half point if it's really close, up to 2 points if there's a clear winner. First, let's look at the game boxes. As you can see, the Lowenherz box is a little too tall to fit vertically on a Kallax game shelf. If you tip it sideways, you can slide it back and it works fine. It just sticks out a little farther than I would like. The DOMAINE box is your standard Ticket to Ride size box, fits perfectly on the shelf. Now, both of these games have beautiful artwork on the box that can really draw you into the game and the theme, and that artwork really is what attracted me to these games originally. I give the slight edge to Lowenherz on the box art because of that border around it, and I think the red text really pops. However, if you look inside the box, DOMAINE has a very helpful insert to store all your components. You don't have to bag them up. Everything kind of holds itself in place, whereas the Lowenherz insert doesn't really do much except look pretty, so you still have to bag up all your components and everything. Therefore, I give the slight edge here to DOMAINE with a half point. Both game boxes are very nice, but that size issue of it fitting better on the shelf as well as the insert, which is very handy, and I do like the artwork on DOMAINE, so DOMAINE gets the half point. Now, what about title and subtitle? Lowenherz, which means Lionheart in German, the boundaries of power, versus DOMAINE, land, wealth, power, prestige. I really like the boundaries of power because you're trying to increase your power by expanding your boundaries. I also like DOMAINE as a title because you're building domains. That's what you're doing. I just don't like the land, wealth, power, prestige. I don't think that really comes through in the gameplay. If I were to name the game, I would combine them and just call it DOMAINE, the boundaries of power. That makes more sense to me as far as what you're actually doing in the game. But since the the title is the most important thing here. Domain is going to get the slight victory, especially because if it's going to be on my shelf, somebody looking at my shelf is going to see domain. I'll be able to explain that much easier than Lowenherz. And I'm trying my best to pronounce that accurately, so forgive me if my pronunciation is totally off on that. Now let's talk about the rule books. Lowenherz has this nice layout for the basic game setup. I actually prefer playing with this basic game setup, which I'll talk more about later. The rulebook is well written. It does seem a little wordy for how simple this game is to learn. I think they could have condensed it a little bit, but it has those nice, colorful examples. It also has a little turn summary on the back, which is handy, and I like the full color front. Domain does not have a cover, but I do think they did a better job sort of organizing the rulebook into a concise and easy to follow format. It's just a little less intimidating when you first learn the game, and because of that, I give Domain a slight half point on the rulebook. But just know that both rulebooks are very good and you can easily sit down and learn the game fairly quickly. Now we're getting into some more important stuff here. Let's talk about the game board and the graphics overall. The board for Lowenherz takes up a little more table space. It's a bit wider, but I love the muted color scheme here. As you can see, those wall pieces really pop on the board. You can really see where the walls are, where each region is located. Now these individual illustrations of the castles and the trees and stuff, those all look cool individually, but when they're all together on the board, they kind of blend in and it's hard to tell them apart. I do like the white neutral spaces. It breaks up the board. It makes the squares easy to count. It makes the black walls easy to see. But when you're just looking out there, you need to be able to see where the hills, the trees, and the castles are, because those are going to do different things in the game. The castles especially are going to score you more points. Domain is very easy to tell where the forests, where the mines, where the villages are. The board colors are more saturated, but you can easily glance out and see where those mines are, where those trees are. So I like that for scoring purposes. Now, I will say the walls stand out so much better on the Lowenherz board. Here you can see the walls kind of blend in with that saturated color scheme. There's not as much contrast there, which is harder on my eyes, and I'm sure other people's as well. So those are just some things I'm really trying to weigh here. I'm really trying to weigh the differences. What is more important here? Another plus on the domain board is the scoring is printed right there on the board. So every time you have to score a region, you just look at the board and it makes it so much easier. Now, both games use this modular board idea. The boards are slightly different sizes. Domain has a 3x3 grid. You can mix and match these for variable setup, and it makes a total square of 144 spaces. The Lowenherz board is a 3x2 grid, so it's more rectangular, but there are more spaces. There's 150 total spaces, and I haven't really noticed a difference as far as how that affects the gameplay. Both games use the lettered cards here to make setup easier. You just shuffle the different letters together and stack them on top of each other, but the domain artwork is a lot fancier. And now the cards themselves, on the left is Lowenherz and on the right is Domain. As you can see, the Lowenherz artwork is simpler and I would argue more functional, easier to spot at a glance. On the right, all you got to look at is the shield and the numbers, but the rest of the art is pretty superfluous and it kind of makes the cards look busier. So I kind of like that simpler look on the left of Lowenherz. I'm not a fan of the bag for the money sign. That means take 8 money, but I don't know why they used a bag. Why not just use a coin? Just a minor gripe. You're going to get a lot more cards in Domain on the right there because the cards function completely differently. That's one of the biggest differences between these games is the card play. But as you can see, you get like twice as many cards in Domain. But overall, as far as game board and graphics, I gotta give the slight edge to Lowenherz with a half point. I go back and forth on this because you have those nice bold colors on the domain board combined with the scoring reference right there on the board. It's very simple to score that game, but it's much harder to see those wall pieces. I really think the wall pieces are more important because they're always changing and moving. I kind of feel like the whole strategy is centered around where those wall pieces are. Where do I want to move them? So to me, Lowenherz a little bit easier on the eyes, and I like that simpler card art. Now let's talk about the plastic pieces. Look at these cool pieces. Both games have really neat plastic pieces, which is quite impressive considering how old these games are. The castles from Domain are very detailed, but at a glance, they kind of just look like a clump of rocks or like crystal or something. And the Lowenherz castles are clearly castles. They have the brick texture, just more rigid looking and just more charming in general. I definitely prefer the Lowenherz castles, although both pieces are neat. Now let's talk about the walls. These again in Lowenherz are more rigid looking. They have that brick texture again, which I like, but they're very thin and fiddly. The Domain walls are much easier to move around. You just grab that center section, but I don't like how they look. They look like little hats out on the board, and I just like this more rigid look. So again, I'm just so torn between these two games. Little things like that. The knights are my favorite pieces in both games. You have these sword shield things from Lowenherz with the engraved symbol on the shield. And then you have, the full knights on horseback with a sword. So cool looking. However, when these pieces are on the game board, this is where I give the slight edge again to Lowenherz because it's easier to tell where your knights and castles are. If you look at the Domain board, it looks like just a jumbled mess of colors, a bunch of blobs of colors. It's hard to tell, where your castles are, where your knights are. So I got to give a full point in favor of Lowenherz here on the plastic pieces. Now the quality is there in both games. You can't go wrong. They're both very high quality pieces, game boards, cards. Everything is very nice, but I'm a very visual person and I like to be able to glance at the board and the cards and not strain my eyes to see what's going on. So that's why I did such a deep dive into the aesthetics. In board games, aesthetics are very important to me personally, but you can make up your own mind with that information. And after all that analysis, the scores are dead tied at 1.5 to 1.5. Remember, we looked at the boxes, the rule books, the graphics, the pieces, and after all that, we're still tied. And you're starting to see why I'm so torn between these games. So let's dive into the more important stuff like the gameplay. I'm going to weight these categories a little heavier by giving up to 3 points in favor of one game or the other. Again, I want to reiterate, these are very different games. The basic idea is the same, building out your walls, expanding your areas, but the scoring, the role of money, the way you carry out your actions are very different. I've never been able to decide which game I like better, so let's dive into some key areas of the gameplay, starting with setup. Now we're set up here for 4 players because this game is definitely best at 4 players. I wouldn't play it with any less. Now remember I said this rule sheet shows you the basic game setup. There's an advanced variant where you can mix and match the tiles, but you don't start with any walls on the board. Instead, you take turns placing your starting castles and knights, but the walls are not built yet. Domain does not give you this option. Domain says just mix and match the tiles. As long as that one city piece is in the center, you mix and match, and you don't start with any walls. Instead, you take turns placing a castle with a knight next to it. Think about the setup for Catan. It's very similar. So you just take turns, you place one castle, and you get to place one knight next to it. Each player takes turns doing that until the board is set up. But again, you don't get any walls to start, and there's nothing in the rules on how to start the game with walls. That's why I like this basic game setup, because every player starts with walls in the corner. Every player has a region to start out with. And to me, that's important because it gets you into the meat of the game faster. It takes a while to build those walls out, and I do think the game really improves when everybody starts off with a region, and that's why we always play that basic setup. So I got to give a full point in favor of Lowenherz, and it's basically because they provide you with the option to start with regions already on the board. It takes a lot of turns to build up those walls, and if you start from scratch, it's just going to make the game take a lot longer, especially if you do that Catan style setup, which I'm not a fan of. If you have Domain, I recommend playing the same board over and over and over again with the same group of people. Don't modulate the squares. Maybe you can come up with a way to start the game with some walls. I just think the game is better when you do it that way because everybody knows where the good spots are on the board and then everybody's fighting for those spots. It just makes for a much more tense and exciting experience. Now let's talk about scoring and winning and a little bit of theme as well. Domain ends as soon as a player plays the last action card from this deck. Or if one player reaches the king, that player wins instantly. So it's kind of like a race to get to the king. The king will be in a different spot based on a 3, 2, or 4-player game. In a 4-player game, the king is at the 30. So if nobody reaches the king, then you get to look at your money. Whoever has the most money gets 5 points. Second most money gets 3 points. So it's like if you play through all the action cards and nobody reaches the king, then all of a sudden money becomes important. But if somebody reaches the king, it just ends the game and money doesn't matter. I don't really understand thematically the two different scoring conditions or why you need two scoring conditions. Lowenherz is very straightforward. You just play through this whole deck. The last card says that the king is dead. Everybody gets 1 more point per mine that they own in their regions. And that's the only end game scoring in this game. So at that point, whoever has the most points wins the game. There's no race. It's a very straightforward scoring system. Now let's look at in-game scoring, especially when you expand regions. So in both games, when you expand, you choose 2 squares adjacent to one of your regions, and you can expand either into a neutral region or into an opponent's region as long as you have more knights than they have. Now in Lowenherz, you have to refer to this chart to see how many points each region is worth. So every time the regions change sizes, you have to count all the squares, refer to this chart, and see how many points that region is worth. And then if it changes tiers, you have to adjust the scoring accordingly. This is my least favorite part of Lowenherz because it is so fiddly. There's a lot of square counting and score adjusting, and thematically it makes a lot of sense. You want those bigger regions, those are worth more points. The rulebook even says, the bigger the better. So it's a very simple idea. You get bigger regions, get more points. I like that. It's easy to understand thematically. You do get your bonuses for those castles and things like that, but it's just not very streamlined. It's a very time-consuming process. Domain, on the other hand, really streamlines the scoring. Now it's just what's inside your domain, not how big it is. So forests, as you can see there, are 1 point each. Villages are 3 point each. The fancy village, there's 5 points. And if you get 3 mines of the same type, that's 5 points. That's the only scoring you have to worry about. So every time, a new domain is formed or a domain changes size, you only have to look at, those villages and those forests. You don't have to count every single square. And that, to me, is Domain's biggest strong point, is that quick, snappy scoring. And that's enough to give it a slight edge in this category of a half point. Now, again, as you can see, I like things about both games. I don't necessarily understand thematically why, forests score points, but meadows don't in Domain. Whereas in Lowenherz, it's just the bigger the region, the more points it's worth. To me, that makes a little more sense, but I don't dread scoring Domain. It's very simple. You just look for trees, look for villages, and score it very quickly. And that leads me right into the next category, which is wonkiness or fiddliness. Domain is very snappy. Like I said, at the beginning of your turn, you simply collect your income from any mines that you have. Then you choose 1 card in your hand, either play the action and pay the cost, or sell the card to the chancery and get the money in the top right. So you're either playing a card or selling a card. On the other hand, in Lowenherz, you flip the top card, which shows 3 possible actions that players can choose. So here we have either take 8 money, place 2 walls, or place 3 walls. Now in turn order, players take turns playing a 1, a 2, or a 3 to dictate which action they would like to do this round. So you go around the table. Then if multiple players choose the same action, you have to resolve that. Only 1 player gets to take each action. So there's a bartering and a negotiation phase that happens if multiple players choose the same thing. Now, if multiple players choose the take money action like we have right here, they would just split the money. So those two players up top there would just get 4 money each. But the rest of the actions, if more than one player chooses that, you have to resolve it. Now, if just 2 people do it, they barter with each other using the money cards that are in their hands. And they might say something like, hey, I'll pay you, 5 coins or 5 ducats to do this action. And the other player's like, no, I really want to do the action. I'll pay you, 8 ducats to do the action, and so on. If you don't set a time limit on this, this is going to drag down the game quite a bit. It already does drag down the pace of the game. Now, I really like the negotiation part of this, so don't get me wrong here. I'm just saying for fiddliness and just pace of the game, snappy decisions, Domain is much more streamlined. I would definitely recommend setting time limits on those bartering negotiation elements in Lowenherz. And another reason I give 2 points to Domain here is that scoring system that we talked about earlier. Again, Lowenherz scoring is much more fiddly. You have to count those squares every single time you score, whereas Domain, you're just looking for forests and villages pretty much. Now let's look at the in-game decisions. So like I showed you before, in Lowenherz, you're going to flip that top card and then players are going to choose the actions in turn order. So either game, Domain or Lowenherz, doesn't have a ton of depth to explore, but the bartering for actions in Lowenherz really improves the overall decision space, in my opinion. You choose that action in turn order, so you can decide whether or not you want to allow the player before you to have an action all to themselves or to challenge them and to a bartering. Maybe you need some money, so you want to just choose that action just to get in a negotiation and get some money. So that I really find interesting in Lowenherz. In Domain, you do not barter at all. You just look at your action cards. You have a hand of 3 cards, and you have symbols showing the different actions. You pick one card to play, and you have to pay that red cost at the top to be able to play the card. Or you can sell the card and get the money in the top right. So your main decision here is, do I have enough money to play this card? Yeah, well, I guess I'll play it and do the action. Or if I don't have enough money, I'll, sell the card and get some money from the bank. So it's just a very simple idea, but not a lot of decision space there. I do like the idea of selling to the chancery because you take your money from the bank, but the card stays face up at the top of the board for other players to then draw on their turns. At the end of your turn, you always draw up to 3 cards. You could either take from the face-up cards or from the action pile there face down. But if you sell a really good card to get a lot of money, then your opponent can come in and just take that card for free. So you do have to weigh some types of decisions, whether to play a card or sell a card, but it's pretty straightforward, whereas the bartering for actions in Lowenherz is much more interesting to explore and experience. Now, the actions you have to choose from are pretty much identical in both games. For example, that sword shield is the same as this card from Domain. That just means you can expand a region or place a new knight out. However, the crown scepter action is a little different in Lowenherz. What this refers to is these politics decks right here. When you choose that action, you get to look through one of these decks and choose one of these special cards. We have the Renegade, and we have an alliance, which is like a peace treaty you can make with your neighbor. We have some hidden treasure card. We have, hidden victory points that stay hidden until the end of the game. These cards stay in your hand with your money cards and are kept secret until you decide to play them. Domain just puts these cards into the action deck with the other cards. So like this purple shield is the same as the Renegade. That lets you place a new knight in your region and then remove an opponent's knight in a neighboring region. So that one's a mean card. The alliance is a peace treaty that you can make with your neighbor where neither one of you can invade into each other's territory. That card is the blue shield in Domain, and it works the same way. However, Domain does not let you break alliances. Lowenherz, you can pay money to break an alliance, and I like that decision as well. So I think this extra little deck with the politics cards is kind of interesting because you can hide some treasure cards and victory cards till the end of the game. That's a little surprise factor. You're always wondering if people took those. There's a little bit of push your luck in which deck to look through. So for the in-game decisions, I give 2 full points to Lowenherz in this category. Domain feels very surface level to me. It seems like the decisions are very straightforward, especially how they change the scoring, because now it's like you're just looking for, forests and villages and maybe some mines if you want to get some income. But it's a much more focused approach, which to me just makes the decisions a little too obvious, and there's just not a lot of depth there. Lowenherz is a much richer experience, even though that bartering does drag down the game quite a bit as far as the pace goes. I just think it makes the game decisions more interesting, especially regarding money too. I mean, all your money is in Lowenherz is a bartering chip to try to do actions in the future. You have to have some money. I mean, there's been times when I've been, out of money and you can't do anything in that game that you want to do. Domain, it's like, oh, I'm out of money. I'll just sell a card, get some money, and then I'll be all right next turn. In Lowenherz, if you choose the take money action and somebody else chooses that, all of a sudden you're splitting that money with them, and that's nowhere near enough to barter your way into doing actions. So it's a much more brutal game if you run out of money. But Domain, it's like, oh, I'll just get some mines to give me income every round, and then I'll just sell some cards. But what I don't like is, like, maybe your money is worth points at the end in Domain, or maybe it's not. If somebody reaches the king first, then your money is not worth any points. So I just don't think the use of money in Domain is that interesting, and that's why Lowenherz gets the big edge here. Now let's talk about luck and randomness and dealing with that. Both games do a pretty good job. Domain gives you the option of drawing face down or face up cards. You can also decide whether to play the card or sell the card, so another way to kind of get out of a bind. In Lowenherz, you are top decking that card every time, so it's random. However, every player is fighting over that same card. So everybody's dealing with the same amount of randomness here, and it boils down to, do you have enough money to barter for the action that you want? So again, that decision is based on your money. That's going to get you out of a tough random card draw. The mines in this game work a little different. These come up randomly throughout the deck, and every time a mine card is drawn, you're going to get a point per mine that you own at that time. Now, the game does tell you there's one mine in each lettered section, so it's a little less random than just totally mixed in the deck. Now, the domain mines work completely differently. In this game, they're just income each round. So each type of mine you own, you're going to get 1 coin each round. So the domain mines aren't lucky or random whatsoever. So Lowenherz gets the slight edge here of a half point. Both games give you options for dealing with luck and randomness. I just think that Lowenherz does it a tad bit better. Other than those random mines coming up, there's not a ton of luck in this game. It's just how well can you use your money to navigate those card draws. Now, I want to talk briefly about appropriate game length. So not just game length, but appropriate game length for what you're trying to do in this game. Yes, Domain is a much more snappy game. It does not drag on. On paper, this should be the better game regarding game length. That's what I usually like. I almost always prefer a more streamlined and more simple approach. However, to achieve the quicker game length, Domain removed the more interesting decisions of competing and bartering for actions. Plus, they streamlined the scoring system so much that I think it takes away from the theme of just trying to expand your areas into your opponent's areas, because now the bigger areas aren't necessarily the best. Therefore, I give the edge to Lowenherz here with a full 1 point. Again, I don't necessarily like how long Lowenherz takes to play. It's a long game. It drags out. That's my biggest issue with it. But I don't think that Domain's shorter length fixes the issues that I have. There needs to be a gameplay change to give the interesting decisions that you get in Lowenherz in a much shorter time. My initial thought is that the board maybe should be smaller or something like that. I just think that the game kind of takes a long time to get going, especially in Domain when you don't start out with those regions already on the board. It just seems like the conflicts take a long time to form, and then the game ends before it gets really good. In Lowenherz, it takes a long time for the conflicts to form as well, but then the second half of the game lasts long enough where players can really try to steal each other's areas back and forth. The bartering definitely drags down the game, but again, I think it's more appropriate for the game. These games are a bit dry. I think the bartering does, liven up the game a little bit, and I think it is the lifeblood of this game. I mean, I think that Domain really took out the heart, the lion heart of the game, if you will. Okay, the final category here is audience appeal. How likely is this game going to get to the table? Now, both of these games require a very specific audience. You need to be okay with cutthroat player interaction. You need to not be upset when somebody tries to steal your territory. So it's a targeted audience already. However, Domain, I think, has a wider appeal. It's a much more streamlined game. It's a little bit easier to get into. Lowenherz has that added bartering and negotiation element. Any game with negotiation is going to be highly group dependent. So Domain, I think, has a better chance of appealing to a wider audience. And that's why I give it a full point, because I think it will see more table time. Okay, we have reached the moment of truth. Let's see which game gets to stay in my collection. After all that, the final score is 6-5 in favor of Lowenherz. So Lowenherz stays in my collection, and Domain will find a happy home somewhere else, I'm sure. Now, I am not trying to convince you that one game is better than the other. I just wanted to present a side-by-side comparison, and hopefully you can decide by looking at those different categories that I presented in this video. So this exercise really helped me to decide something that I've been going back and forth on for a long time. I think it really helped to dive into each category individually to help me better understand which game I actually do like better. So if you ever have a game that you're going back and forth on, which one you want to keep, which one you want to get rid of, how do you go about deciding? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your method. I'm going to do more videos like this in the future because I think it's a fun way to really showcase some of these lesser known games while simultaneously doing the important work of curating my collection and thinning it down to the bare essentials. I think all of us have been there in board gaming where we get so many games built up and it's just time to thin out the collection a little bit. We can't keep every game, even though I would love to. And again, I want to hear your methods for deciding whether to keep or get rid of a game. Let me know in the comments section below. I would love to read those. And once again, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you can get updates on more undiscovered games like this. And if you want to support the channel farther, there's a PayPal link in the description below. You can donate any amount you like, but the best way to support this is subscribe, share, like, comment, and follow me over on Instagram at undiscovered_games. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I'll be back next time with a normal episode featuring another hidden gem or a lesser known board game. We'll see you then.